This week on Inside Olympia, charting the decline of Statehouse news coverage in Washington State. That's the topic of a new report from the University of Washington. What's driving this trend? What are the civic impacts? And are there any bright spots? We ask the report's co-author, Professor Matthew Powers.
From the TVW studio, it's Inside Olympia with host Austin Jenkins.
And welcome to Inside Olympia. Washington State's Capitol Press Corps has shrunk from 30 reporters back in 1987 to 8 as of last year. That's according to a recently released report from the University of Washington. The situation mirrors what has been happening in state capitals across the country. So what are the consequences when there are fewer reporters covering state government? What does it say about broader trends in the news business? And are there any bright spots or silver linings? Joining me now, and for the full hour this week, to discuss the report and the state of journalism is University of Washington Professor of Communication and the co-author of the report, Professor Matthew Powers. Welcome to the program. Good to see you.
Good to see you, too.
I should mention that you were also the co-director of the Department of Communications Center for Journalism, Media, and Democracy.
That's right.
And the author of a recent book called The Journalist's Predicament, Difficult Choices in a Declining Profession. So, first off, what prompted this study? And I should also mention that I was one of the reporters that was interviewed for it, in the interest of full disclosure.
That's right, and we appreciate your willingness to have spoken with us.
And you got quite a list of people to speak with you for this. But what was the impetus or the inspiration for looking specifically at Statehouse reporting in Washington State and contemplating sort of what that trend line is?
So it's really started from an observation that there have been changes in both state government and in local journalism, and that both of those changes impact both the importance of local news, and particularly Statehouse news, and also raise questions about who's going to provide it. And so on the state government side, state governments have gone in the past several decades from being what one political scientist referred to somewhat derisively as the runt in the litter of American policymaking to really the sort of central place in which a lot of policymaking actually happens in the United States. And at the same time as that's happened, you've had real big changes in the business of media in general and local news in particular that sort of restructures which news organizations provide this coverage, how many resources they actually dedicate to it, and what types of coverage they do. And so our real motivation was to document what this looks like in the state that we all live in and to try and make sense of what the implications are for the Statehouse coverage that people actually end up getting.
And obviously what's happening in Washington State is playing out in states across the country. How much were you and are you thinking about this in terms of Statehouse coverage specifically versus Statehouse coverage being a microcosm for broader changes, disruption, decline in the journalism industry?
So I think there's a little bit of both going on. So one, it's important to understand in and of itself because Statehouses are important because the bills that get passed in Statehouses impact, the roads we drive on, the schools we send our children to, and so on. However, in a lot of ways, what we have with Statehouse reporting in particular is kind of a microcosm of issues that confront political journalism more generally. And that's to say that there's strong ideals, there's a sense that it's important to inform citizens, that it's important to hold the powerful to account, but there are realities seemingly everywhere where a lot of people either don't care to consume the news or are disinterested in news that doesn't accord with the opinions they already have. Political officials are very capable of ignoring news media that is going to subject them to critical questioning. And news organizations themselves, again, seemingly everywhere, are confronted by serious economic challenges. And so in some sense, what we have in the Statehouse is a sort of tiny microcosm of an issue that confronts political journalists in particular more generally.
A couple data points. One, to sort of drive home the point that Statehouses are where the action is in terms of public policy making. There's a husband and wife pair of legislators in Montana, and the husband told me that between the two of them, he's in the Senate, she's in the House, they passed more laws in Montana in 2023, they have every other year sessions, than Congress passed in the entirety of its session.
Sure. Yeah.
So just to put in context sort of how little is happening at the federal level, at least in terms of the passage of actual laws and how much is happening at the state level. The other data point is that as the state has grown population-wise, The state budget has grown by leaps and bounds. The number of lobbyists has held fairly steady, as have the number of legislators. But while there's been a lot of growth trends in this state over the last decade or even longer, the number of reporters covering the state has declined. So there's sort of there's an up escalator and a down escalator.
Yeah, it's funny you say that because that's the image that I always think of too. It's like we have one thing that's going up and another thing that's going down, and that's not a good combination of things to have going. There's nothing in and of itself problematic per se about increasingly strong state governments, and there are many good reasons why that's developed. But it is problematic and it is worrisome when you have fewer and fewer reporters able to cover it.
Let's also just interrogate the idea that declining press coverage is a bad thing, because there's a lot of people who don't trust the news media these days, who don't like journalists, and might actually cheer or celebrate the idea that there's fewer of these rascals, myself included, running around the State House.
Sure. Yeah. No, that's fair. Of course, issues of trust in media are not new. However, there is something important about what State House reporters are able to provide.
So what is that? I mean, what is the argument for why any citizen, any taxpayer, anybody, regardless of their political ideology, should want boots on the ground in their state capital covering what's happening?
Yeah. So one reason actually has nothing to do with people actually reading it, but just the presence of reporters. And that's that there actually is pretty good political science research that shows that the presence of independent news media in cities and in state capitals actually reduces instances of corruption, political malfeasance, and so on and so forth. And so it's, in some sense, just good to have the threat of publicity there that might keep some, lawmakers, lobbyists from doing things that they might do if they weren't worried about it being exposed. So that's one piece. Sure. Another piece is simply that it's, of course, important that people feel a sense of efficacy and an ability not just to be subject to the laws of the state that they're living in, but having some ability to actually be aware of them and to shape them consciously. And of course, that varies, and of course, people have extremely busy lives, and we shouldn't for a minute think that the State House press corps from 30 years ago or even before then was without problems or not in need of change. However, there is something very important about the fact that we have so many bills and so few people to be able to cover them.
Well, let's go back to the sort of days of yore where there is some nostalgia for that. And as you say, it's not as if that was without flaw or fault. Certainly in that era, it was a very male-dominated profession generally, and that was very much true in terms of who populated the Olympia press corps. Yeah. But it was also a time when, I think, as we mentioned, there were as many as 30 reporters, and we see historic photographs of governors' news conferences that were packed to the gills. And there were columnists. Adele Ferguson comes to mind as somebody who was a very famous and columnist who wasn't afraid to sort of poke a finger in the eye of legislators and get them all riled up and say it bluntly. Yeah. I mean, those days are long gone. But what as you did this research and you think about that era, what would you draw out as good about that time?
So part of what was useful is simply the amount of experience that was there. So there's many issues that you've mentioned in terms of it being overwhelmingly male. We could also note that it was overwhelmingly emphasizing politicians and not the effects of policy, that it was very much sort of what's sometimes referred to as process reporting rather than
turn of the screw,
and so much less about how does this impact people outside of Olympia or just outside of the state, the State House itself.
Sort of breathless reporting, Dateline Olympia, here's what they did today.
Exactly. And so that was certainly part of an issue. However, having people, particularly for some of the larger news organizations, having multiple people, that was really important.
Because back in the day, I mean, even when I started 20 years ago, 3 reporters for the the Associated Press. Yep. And I think that they augmented, at least with an intern during session, 3 reporters full-time for the Seattle Times. Yep. And then other newspapers around the state were sending people for session or had somebody here permanently year-round.
So one important aspect of that is that if you have at least 2 people, one person can go to those press conferences and another person can actually be freed to do some enterprise reporting, to be able to do some reporting about what happens to this policy out in the real world. to be able to not be completely subject to the whims of politicians. Because if the governor is going to call a press conference, you can't be a major news organization in the state of Washington and not go to it. But that also means that it's difficult to do things independently on your own, et cetera. So that would be one piece. Yeah. Another piece would simply be that the reporters of the past typically had long careers, relatively long careers in Olympia, and through that they were able to build up, among other things, sort of deep knowledge of the process, a sort of deep sense of a Rolodex of people to call about particular issues, and that can certainly create a sort of insiderism that is not in and of itself a sort of unalloyed good, but it also means that you have a sort of deep understanding of what's going on. Now, that doesn't mean that the younger reporters that are there now are not able to do that or that they don't do that, but simply that having something like 15, 20 years of professional, not just professional experience, but experience in Olympia provides people with a sort of deep knowledge that they can then even share with younger cohorts when they're coming in.
Let's just look at some of the findings and numbers from your report, because in addition to interviewing a lot of people, you also ran a lot of data and looked at sort of the historical trend lines. So let's take a look at sort of then and now, and we'll go back to 2000. I mentioned the stat from much earlier, but as of 2000, there were 19 reporters covering Olympia on a full-time basis, and that was 4 years before I started covering Olympia. And by 2023, that number had dropped to 8. And you do note the sort of loss of institutional knowledge, the experience of those who left on average, had, I guess, been here 17 years. Is that what that refers to, as an average of 17 years?
That's right, yeah.
And by contrast, the existing press corps today has an average tenure on the beat of about 2 years. There's been a lot more turnover, and it hasn't been an opportunity for newer, younger reporters to join the press corps. But with that comes less experience. And then there's another set of kind of data points here. One is that as you look at Olympia coverage today, about a third of it is emanating from outside of Olympia. So reporters from the home front or the home ship back in the mothership back in Seattle might be reporting on what's happening in Olympia, but doing so from Seattle. Yeah. Or maybe a reporter in the Tri-Cities is reporting on something that their delegation's doing. So that's about a third of the coverage about Olympia isn't actually happening on the ground here. And then about 40% of it is providing contextual rather than process coverage, which could be viewed as perhaps an improvement, explaining what it means. And then who's covering the State House? 54% of those covering the State House are full-time State House reporters. That includes interns that come down during the session, beat reporters who cover other beats, but where there's crossover with the legislative agenda or state government and state policy, about 20%. General assignment reporters who kind of get a new assignment every day, and sometimes that means go to Olympia or cover Olympia, that's 17%, and then other is about 10%. So again, then and now, what are some of the upsides that you see? I will note that in addition to having a younger press corps, a less experienced press corps, we also have a majority women press corps now, which has never been the case historically.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the last legislative session, it was 7 of 8 of the people who were full-time reporters were women and under the age of 40, and usually far south of that, which is a huge change.
If I'm not mistaken, I remember, there was a time when Rachel LaCourte, who used to be with the Associated Press, was the only woman in the press corps. She was joined at some point by Melissa Santos, who was with the News Tribune and Crosscut and other outlets. But 1, 2 at the most, in my experience, for most of the time.
Yeah, and not to put too fine a point on it, but this is the early 2000s that you're talking about. And so this has happened fairly quickly and fairly dramatically. So that's one bright spot, and it's not simply that they're younger or that they're not all men, but that they also are embracing a sort of different vision of what political journalism is or could be, and that's much less process oriented. Of course, they still have to do some of the process stories.
Go to the governor's news conference, right?
Of course, because they have to, and because their editors want them there.
Cover the bills of interest.
But when you ask them about what are the stories that you really enjoy doing, what are the stories that you're really aiming to do, they are a lot more sort of contextual, a lot more how does this policy actually affect ordinary people? What happens when you actually get outside of Olympia, and what does this actually look like to people? And so that's a difference. The statistic that you showed about beat reporters is, I think, also a hopeful spot. It's not, of course, that we didn't have beats 20, 30 years ago, but the number of beats have actually expanded. The definition of what constitutes politics across those beats have also expanded. And so we have people who have real knowledge of education or the environment or of transportation who are able to come down, and they're able to bring some of that knowledge and to be able to report on different types of stories in different types of ways. And to give you a sense of what that means concretely, the number of voices or sources that are cited that are non-politicians is about twice as high for people who do not work the State House beat. Now, that makes perfect sense. If you're working the State House, of course you should be talking to politicians. But of course, one of the things that's useful is actually getting other perspectives, other voices, civil society voices, people from advocacy groups, people from business, so that you can try and get a bigger and more complete picture. And the other thing that some of the beat reporters are doing is that, it's about 40% of the coverage that they do tends to be a lot of this sort of contextual. So not just there's a bill about affordable housing, but
how did we get here?
How did we get here?
How are we going to get out of this?
How are we going to get out of here? And what's this actually going to look like?
Yeah, what have other places done? Those kinds of things.
Exactly.
So and by the way, when I was covering Olympia full-time for public radio, I was often telling my colleagues who were beat reporters, look, I can't do it all. I mean, I'm down here trying to cover the waterfront. There's 1,500 bills. There's too much going on. You as the beat reporter should be covering Olympia. There's opportunities if you're on the environment beat, the energy beat, the education beat, to hook in, and I'll help, but I can't do it all. And so I think there's actually real value in, even if the reporter isn't based here or can't come down here, they can work with the State House reporter who might help them with some sources or pull some string. And I do think that makes for stronger coverage of this place. So we've looked at data points, but I also want to really acknowledge how much time you and your co-authors spent interviewing people who past and present reporters and others. So what are some themes of what emerged from these extensive interviews? What were you hearing? Was there a lot of lament? Was there some optimism, frustration, any hope for the future? What was the takeaway?
I would say all of the above, and with varying proportions depending on who you're speaking to. Because of course, if you were part of an era in which you had, multiple people working for the same news organization in a bureau, you're probably not going to be disposed to looking at this and saying, this is actually looks great, right? So there are legitimate concerns that you hear from both past and current State House reporters about their ability to do the job that they would like to be able to do. But one of the things that surprised me, given a lot of the national conversation about political journalism being in decline, particularly at State Houses, is that actually not universally, but almost everybody had a view that maybe we've sort of reached a low point and maybe things are back on the rise. And maybe things are back on the rise partly because traditional news organizations are kind of coming up with different ways of approaching this by sending beat reporters, by trying to focus less on turn of the screw and more on, outcomes, but also because we have a whole series of, new providers, whether it's someone like Paul Query, who's, a longtime AP reporter who's founded his own Substack that's, subscription-based, or whether it's, an organization like State's Newsroom that has opened up State House bureaus in every single capital in the country.
All over the country.
Yeah.
What was your sense in doing these interviews about the general sense of the industry? And, so there's sort of the decline of State House coverage, but, I often think would a working reporter today be right to recommend to a young person coming up to get into this business, or would that be malpractice because you'd be advising them to, get into an industry that's, looks like it might be doomed? But was there any sort of sense of that kind of is journalism still worth it?
I think that is the question that in some basic way confronts every single person who decides that this is a career worth going into. So it confronts students who are making the decision and then having to explain to their parents, I'm going to university and that's wonderful and I'm studying journalism, which at least some parents are going to say, wait a second, why would you be doing that? And that's all true. And there are very, very serious economic issues that confront the news media. I think there are bright spots. I think it's complicated. I think for local news, the issues are not at all the same as some of the issues confronting some of the national news media. However, the thing that I take solace in, or the thing that I'm, sort of constantly inspired by, if I can be frank, is that we have people who are in no way unaware of how difficult it is, and they still go into these careers. And so if you think about it just in very practical terms, every working journalist, and this is certainly true in Olympia, knows that they could have better hours, better pay, and more stability if they would just go work for a public relations firm or do communications consulting of some sort. And that work can be important, it can be meaningful. But the fact that we still actually have people doing this kind of thing, I think suggests something important that's not entirely limited to just journalists. And I think that there's certain types of jobs in society that people go into precisely because they sort of prioritize things other than money. Now, it's not that people don't want a salary.
Right.
It's not that journalists don't deserve a better salary. But it does mean that there is a kind of sense that there's more to life than money. And actually being able to do something meaningful, being able to do something exciting, being able to do something that seems interesting is actually in some sense kind of offsetting some of the material concerns that might actually be involved.
Well, I've often described it as a calling. I mean, it may be a profession in reality. I try to be quite humble about it. It's a trade, right? But people are drawn to it because they're called to it for the most part. And that's at least what keeps people in it, because there are a lot of reasons that one might get fed up, frustrated, and decide to exit. But you are working with some of the interns, University of Washington interns who are down here this session, working for news outlets. I know you met with some of them while you were before we sat down to talk. What do you notice in your conversations with them, and again, observations about what's inspiring them or animating them to do this?
So first, a sort of data point that I could give just about the role of student interns in news coverage, that I can talk about their perceptions. About 10% of all coverage that gets produced each session is coming from student interns, not just the University of Washington, Washington State University. And so they are no longer just, in my day, we were the people who got coffee and, maybe helped to prep someone for an interview. They're coming in and they are reporters from day one. So they're an important piece of the emergent ecology and even part of the solution. Now, what do I hear? The thing that has caught my attention the most is that when I ask students, has this been a good experience for you? Would you recommend it to another student? Universally and without any exception, I hear, yes, of course. I learn skills on the fly. I learned so much more than I could ever do just in a classroom.
Right.
It's fantastic. It really gives me a sense of actually reporting and doing something, meaningful, et cetera. And then I asked them, well, would you want to go into political reporting more generally? And I haven't found very many students who actually say yes to that.
Now, are they saying no to reporting, or are they just saying no to political reporting?
Political reporting specifically.
So they might still want to be in the journalism business.
Most of them actually do.
Oh.
Most of them do. Of course, they kind of hedge their bets and they say, I'm not really sure. One of the questions asked is, where do you see yourself in 5 years? And of course, that's an extremely difficult question to answer when you have an industry that's characterized by as much insecurity and uncertainty as the news business. However, almost all of them say, yeah, I'd like to be in journalism. But almost all of them also say, I don't want to do it in politics. And I think that's partly, an expression of a dissatisfaction with institutional politics more generally, a sense that I don't really want to be around, politicians all the time. I'm more interested in trying to speak to everyday people and their concerns.
Just before we go to break, what is your sense of I know you looked at urban versus rural coverage and sort of communities being served.
Yeah.
Now, of course, you were looking at Statehouse coverage, and then we'll talk after the break about a report that looked more broadly at local news coverage in Washington. But what did you notice about how rural communities in the state are being served by Statehouse coverage?
So I think the answer there is not particularly well. And I don't think that's surprising, but we do try and put some numbers on it. And so, for instance, issues of housing affordability, which are major issues primarily in urban centers across Washington state, are 8 times more likely to receive coverage than agricultural issues. And so there are sort of basic ways in which people from non-urban, non-suburban areas are not really getting much in terms of the coverage.
Yeah. So, and I'll just observe that back in my day, there were reporters from the Tri-City Herald here full time. We had a reporter at least come up for session from the Vancouver Columbian. Yeah. The Spokesman Review had a substantial bureau. So newspapers outside of the core Puget Sound area had representation here, and that's much less true. And then just another observation is I remember when the bottom started to fall out of the newspaper industry in the sort of 2005 lead up to the Great Recession, and then certainly after. And there was a period of time there where it's not much of an exaggeration to say that almost every Friday, it was like they were dropping like flies. Reporters were leaving mostly on their own. They were seeing the writing on the wall, so they didn't get laid off, but they thought that they would, and they were looking for jobs. Yeah. And that attrition was really noticeable during that period, but in essence, that was sort of the beginning of it, and we never recovered from it, although, as you know, there's a couple bright spots.
Yeah.
Okay, let's take a quick break. When we return, we'll continue our conversation with Professor Matt Powers, back right after this. And welcome back to Inside Olympia. Joining me once again is Professor Matt Powers from the University of Washington, here to discuss a recent report on the decline of Statehouse coverage in Washington state. And I want to ask you about, we've talked a lot about the journalists and what they want and what they're feeling, and you interviewed them, but ultimately you do this work in service of voters, citizens, the public. And I'm curious, and we've just, before the break talked a little bit about rural areas being underserved perhaps by the ratio of the kind of stories and the topics that reporters are gravitating towards. If you have mostly reporters from urban publications, they're going to be covering issues of greatest interest to those readers, and perhaps at the expense of issues like ag that might be more of interest, for instance, to readers east of the Cascades. But let's talk a little bit about what did you learn in this study about what the audience wants? How interested are they in Statehouse coverage? Do they kind of understand and engage with this, or is it sort of flyover country?
So there is a very dedicated, as I'm sure you no doubt know, there is a very dedicated group of people that really care about this.
They're watching this show right now.
They're watching this show. Yeah. And they are absolutely not in the majority of Washington state citizens. I think the key thing to think about or to remember when we think about Statehouse reporting is to note that it's often technical. It requires a high level of knowledge in order to be able to not just understand like what's this bill about, but also to be able to understand like basic things like there's a bill, but is this actually going to pass? Like what's the strategy behind this? And all of those are
There's a paint drying element to this, let's be honest.
There's a paint drying element, but also there's an aspect in which, of course, nobody is actually excluded from being able to understand it, but the level of insider knowledge that's required in order to be able to understand is actually quite high. And that does function as kind of a screen that eliminates a lot of people from otherwise getting in.
And maybe I should even, I was being a little flip, but there's a bouncing ball element. It's not as if you read the story and can move on. It's like, well, if you're really interested, you're going to have to follow the bouncing ball because the bill passed a committee. Yes. Or maybe it got across through one chamber, but now we got to see what happens over in the next chamber. So process can really bog down coverage, and I think make it hard to keep. It's not like a basketball game.
Exactly.
Right?
It's not like a basketball game, and I think it's always been true that that's been the case, and there have been changes in many things, but one of the things that I would point out that's really changed is that people now have a lot more options, and so it's no longer
and
the
more
case.
Distractions.
More options, one of which is, or many of which are distractions, right? And we all have that. However, it is the case that, people don't have to read things that they don't want to. They don't have to watch things that they're not interested in. And so if you sort of combine the fact that there's already a sort of high level of entry to be able to understand and grasp, not because people are not intelligent, but simply because they don't actually have the time, and because the way in which it's covered might actually be difficult for them to actually get into. And so there
And I
is-
sometimes wonder if they're even seeing it. Because
that's-
especially to your point, the algorithms are determining what most of us are seeing.
Yeah.
Unless we're literally picking up the newspaper or turning on the radio or TV.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that can be extremely disheartening is to tell people who don't work at national news outlets just how little attention audiences pay. And by audiences, I mean all of us in our online lives. It is typically at the global level, something less than 2% of all the activity that we do online is related to local news consumption. And so we do an extraordinary amount of stuff, and very little of it is actually about local news.
On the other hand, is there, like, if we look at research, what is the level of public interest in what's happening or what their state leaders are doing? Is there kind of an inverse here where there's actually interest, at least in theory, if not in practice?
So I think it depends on who you ask, and then I think it also depends on how it's presented. I mean, the major issue that is really the problem from both the economic and a social perspective from news organizations, particularly at the local level, is that we've gone from these low-choice environments to high-choice ones, and we've also gone from environments where news organizations, particularly regional and local news media, actually had market power to be able to actually get advertisers. And effectively, both of those things are reversed. And so audiences now can go anywhere, and news organizations really don't have the power to be able to actually decide, advertising rates and stuff like that. And that's been a sort of difficult combination.
So, and that's been difficult for the business model. What do you think, as an academic who studies this, about the impact on democracy and civil society? On the one hand, people do have more, there's less gatekeeping and it used to be the three white men news anchors kind of intoning about the news of the day nationally and globally, 3 network channels. Now the options are endless, and there's much more kind of ability to, literally everybody has a microphone and a broadcast booth and a printing press in the palm of their hand these days. Yeah. But we're also not all kind of getting the same news, which then we can debate kind of from that starting point.
Absolutely. So all of those things are true. We live in a golden age of information for those who are interested in seeking it out, for those who are fascinated by it, who really want to have it as part of their everyday diet. And those people are extremely well served in this information environment, from the local to the national news level to internationally. Absolutely.
If you want it, you can probably find it.
Exactly.
And then find more.
And more. However, we are in no way representative of the public at large or society more generally.
So what is if you were to start to think about a prescription for rebuilding Statehouse coverage and, dare I say, re-engaging, but maybe we never did a great job of engaging, but let's say re-engaging audiences. I know it's hard to fix the business model piece, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment, but any takeaways or thoughts or advice after interviewing reporters, looking at the trend lines, kind of looking at the audience trends as well, and thinking about the difficulty of getting people to engage and care about Statehouse coverage?
So one thing to sort of note is that we're already kind of seeing the future in the present. And so, we see that we have some of the same traditional providers that are much more scaled down than they used to be. Seattle Times, Spokesman Review, and they are complemented by a series of digital offerings, whether it is the Washington Observer, whether it is Axios Local, et cetera, the State Standard, that are all involved in providing some local news, all of which kind of creates a question of, who this is going to be for. So is it going to be for those who are already interested, or, for people, is it going to be a way to get people involved and interested who are not otherwise?
I imagine interest also peaks when the news is bad. Right now the state's in the midst of a budget crisis. There's actually ads on TV from competing or dueling interests about that. I would imagine awareness is being raised, and when, again, the news is bad as opposed to good, people tend to pay more attention. Do you have any sense of just the extent to which this comes in waves, or there might be periods of time when people are paying more attention to Olympia?
It certainly comes in waves. These types of things can often reinforce a view that, you know what, nothing ever works. All I ever hear is negative things. I don't understand why these issues exist. You know, I have the same issues now that I've had 10 years ago, those types of things. And so the fact that attention goes up doesn't necessarily mean that satisfaction or trust does along with it.
I want to mention TVW. Perhaps this is a plug for TVW, but it was part of your report. And I'm interested to know how you think sort of a C-SPAN style television channel, which obviously provides gavel-to-gavel coverage on television and online, but also produced programming, an educational component for kids in school. How does an entity like TVW help sort of fill in a gap, or how does it become more important in an era of declining press?
Well, so one of the things that's important about TVW is that it's a not-for-profit that is not actually as concerned with, you know, of course, you want an audience to be able to watch your programs. You're not doing this for nobody. However, you're not as taken by, you know, you're not making editorial decisions as strictly based on, is someone going to watch this or are they not? And so one of the things that allows for is a certain degree of experimentation. And I think that can be really, really healthy. I think one of the things that's interesting is that a lot of the experimentation that's coming more generally in the US is not coming necessarily exclusively from commercial providers, but also from nonprofits. And so TVW is one piece of that picture.
And I'll just mention that I made the transition a couple of years ago from covering one state legislature, this state legislature, for a consortium of public radio stations, in addition to hosting this show. And now I work for Pluribus News, covering all 50 state legislatures. We're a digital startup.
Yep.
My boss, Reed Wilson, I think, talked to you about what he saw as an opportunity, but what's your impression of, you talked about sort of digital startups, new media, whether it's Pluribus or other examples, what's your sort of thinking about, you know, we're not focused on one state and helping that, you know, the hometown voter necessarily understand what's going on, but we are certainly in service of the idea that state houses are where the action is, and somebody should be connecting the dots, identifying the trends, highlighting and spotlighting what's going on.
So I think it's a wonderful idea, and I'm very, you know, I read it. I'm keen to get it in my inbox every morning. And I'm also keen to see, you know, how it evolves and the question of sustainability that confronts any digital news outlet. You know, one of the things for a lot of these digital outlets that are doing this, particularly at the national level, is that they are in fact trying to recreate the model that has in fact failed most print newspapers, which is to say they're primarily advertising driven, because they're still offering the content thus far for free. And the sort of bet is that they can do what newspapers no longer can, which is that they can aggregate the right types of people, give those people content that they're interested in, and then, in a sense, sell that audience to advertisers who are interested in them. And so it'll be very interesting to see if it works for Pluribus, but also for other news organizations that have a similar strategy.
Yeah, definitely new and emerging models for doing this, and it is reflective of a, you know, the audiences are split. It's not mass media anymore. It's much more channeled towards specific interests or people who need to know. So let me, and that's a nice segue, by the way, to talk more about sort of what's roiling the industry more generally from a business standpoint. And I want to do sort of building blocks here. So you were very focused for this report, you and your colleagues and co-authors, on state capitol coverage. And again, we could extrapolate what's happened in Olympia to most other state capitals around the country. A couple of years ago, in 2022, I want to give a nod to the League of Women Voters, who we had on this program, who did a report looking at the decline of local news more generally in Washington state. And one of the things that they found is that newsroom staffing had fallen, and I'm sorry, I don't have the dates here, the date range, but had fallen 67%. I would guess that was over, I know that they say weeklies, they talk about weeklies closing between 2004 and 2022. It was probably kind of in that a 15 to 20 year range. But what are some observations you have about sort of more generally what's happening? And let me just bring one more data point into this. The Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern in Evanston, Illinois, puts out an annual report on the decline of local news. Their latest report found that last year, 127 more newspapers went out of business. 55 million Americans have limited or no access to local news. So there's an increasing number of news deserts. They say the nation has lost more than 1/3 of its newspapers since 2005, and that the number of news deserts rose to 208. So those are counties, I believe, that don't have local news outlets. What does this broader trend in local news declining mean? What's its significance and impact?
Well, so just in terms of the trend itself, in terms of local news, I think the key point here is that local news faces issues that are much different and much more difficult to actually solve than some of the national news outlets do.
I sometimes think of the national news outlets. I mean, the New York Times is a good example. Remember when we were talking during the Great Recession about banks that were too big to fail? Of course, they might not have been too big to fail. But there's an element to that. Like, if you're the New York Times, you might at this point be too big to fail, which is kind of ironic because at one point they were getting a loan from some
Carlos Slim.
This business guy in Mexico to try to stay afloat. But my times have changed, and they're pretty solid. But that's the New York Times, not the Olympian, not the Tri-City Herald, not the Everett Herald.
Yeah. So the happy version of that story is that there was a period where even the New York Times seemed as if it could fail, and that no longer appears to be the case, and it's on relatively good financial footing. Right. It's much less clear that that local news providers can follow that same strategy because they are not able to command advertising, because in developing subscriptions, they are much more constrained. So the New York Times has certainly the whole country and to varying degrees the entire world as a potential subscriber base. No matter how good you are in Yakima, it's going to be very difficult to get anybody outside of Yakima to be able to subscribe to the Herald. Now, that doesn't have anything to do with the quality of the content.
But your subscriber base in local news is by default going to be smaller.
And it was never the case that the subscribers were actually the source of the business model, right? So it was advertisers. So to give you a sense, the Seattle Times, around the same time that the New York Times was worried that it might be going out of business, they testified to the legislature, I think this was 2009 or something, that they were getting something like 70% of their revenue from advertising. Now, it's effectively flipped. 70% of the Seattle Times revenue now comes from subscriptions. Right. And so they've really been able to change that and transform that. But that's in the biggest city in the state. It hasn't been without pain. So they've certainly had to lay people off. They've had to make difficult decisions. And also, it's not entirely clear that we're done. It's not as if these changes have stopped. It's still the case that people who are 60 years of age or older are still getting most of their news from television and to a lesser degree from print. And
young people are not necessarily subscribing.
Not at all. Yeah. Not at all. And so there's something where the news habit hasn't been forming for decades, and that hasn't changed, and it's not changing.
And so if you're the local newspaper and you're struggling already, and then you look at the pipeline of who's your customer of tomorrow. Yeah. It's pretty worrisome.
It's absolutely worrisome. And that's an issue that local news everywhere around the country is facing. Some, better, some worse, but it's a difficult picture. It's a very, very difficult environment. So one of the things it raises a question about is the extent to which there is a commercial solution to this, or whether there can be some sort of, policy, nonprofit, other types of mechanisms or initiatives that if, politicians are going to say, at least some of them are going to say, that a free press is important to democracy, there might be a certain moment where you have to kind of put your money where your mouth is, as it were.
And that leads us to something else I wanted to ask you about, which is sort of efforts by state legislatures increasingly to look for ways to shore up local news. And with the Seattle Times, you reminded me of another data point, which was their president talked, Alan Fisco, a few years back about if an ad, to the extent that they are still relying on digital ads online, if a digital ad campaign is run through Facebook, I can't remember the percentage, but for some reason 70% sticks in my mind. But essentially, they're getting a fraction of the ad revenue on an ad campaign that runs through Facebook. Whereas if they can run it directly, they get 100%. Yeah. So one of the things that we're seeing, one of the emerging trend lines, is state legislatures trying to make "quote unquote" big tech pay for news. California had a couple of bills last year and ended up not passing either of them, but striking a deal with Google to pay for news. We're sort of waiting to see how that's going to play out. There's a similar, there's legislation in Illinois this year and some other states. What are your thoughts on this effort to say, well, if what's bleeding newspapers dry is not just the fact that subscriptions are hard to sell, but realistically, they lost their advertising base because classifieds went away, Craigslist took over, and now digital ads. Let's force the big trillion-dollar companies to help throw some money in to support democracy, civic knowledge, and journalism. You think that that's a proper role of state legislatures? Does that hold promise? Is it too little, too late?
It's an interesting question. So just to give a sense of how much Google and Facebook actually get, it's something like about half of all online advertising actually goes to them in terms of dollars globally.
This is why some think that they are, in effect, monopolies.
They absolutely are. And so one of the questions that gets raised is whether or not transferring some of those funds via state legislatures or...
I should mention Canada and Australia have done this too.
So
Maybe this is where you're headed.
Yeah, so absolutely. So Canada and Australia have done it as well. And one of the things in particular that the case of Australia has raised is which of the news organizations are actually getting that funding. Because of course in Australia, it's already an extremely concentrated news market. And in effect, what was happening was the government of Australia was intervening on behalf of legacy publishers to get, in some sense, a transfer of wealth from tech companies to media companies. Now, that's a decision. Politicians can do that, and they can be, voted in or out based on that. But it's not necessarily precisely about actually saving news. It's more about preserving incumbents. And so I think one of the questions in any of these things is how is it structured so that it's actually addressing the problem, which is about the provision of news that people care about, and not necessarily actually trying to, just save a particular category of news organization.
I know in California they were trying to create a system that essentially required the money to be put back into hiring reporters, keeping reporters, but there was certainly criticism that it was going to advantage the larger conglomerates. While there are a lot of local newspapers still, many of them are owned by out-of-state conglomerates, even private equity-owned entities now. And so there was a criticism that you're just going to be moving money from a trillion-dollar tech company to a very large private equity firm and not necessarily solving the problem. We also saw Google and Meta essentially saying, well, if you do this, we're going to stop carrying news. We're going to throttle news, and that's going to hurt the news entities more because they rely on our traffic to get their stories seen and out there.
And it's not entirely clear whether it's such a great thing for news organizations to themselves be reliant further on platforms. So there's kind of interesting questions. Now, one of the things is that that's just one option on a sort of menu of possibilities that confront policymakers both at the state and at the federal level. And so it's not as if that's the only way of doing it. There's many other ways in which you could support public media. The U.S. remains anemic, frankly, in terms of per capita funding for public media. I don't expect that that's going to change anytime in the next 4 years.
No, it might actually go the other direction based on current trend lines.
I was going to say, I don't think there's a happy story there, but it's absolutely true and it's absolutely the case that you can have quality public media that is independent and not beholden to, the state. There's also many instances of state broadcasters where that's not at all the case, but it's not as if it's impossible to do. And then there's also a variety of, content neutral measures that could be taken. So for instance, this is not original to me, but there has been, the idea of if news is really that important, why don't we give every single citizen, over the age of 16, 18, you name it, a voucher for a news subscription every year. They get to pick. They get to pick which news organization. Of course, there's going to be questions, just as there are with nonprofit giving, what qualifies and what constitutes it. But that would be a way of, inducing people to be more involved in news consumption while also providing an actual form of support.
She also mentioned that Washington State followed or copied something that California pioneered, which was state funding for a News Fellows program. Yeah. The idea that the state, through the Washington State University and the Murrow School of Journalism, is now funding positions in newsrooms to try to repopulate. And it's not just here in Olympia, although some of the fellows are here. Do you have any thought about, and I think when public dollars start to get involved, some people brace a little bit and are like, do we really want to mix? Isn't the idea that we want an arm's length? We want separation of church and state. Do we want public tax dollars funding journalism, at least directly?
So I would say it's always a question of, the money has to come from somewhere. And it's not as if having commercially funded news doesn't have some of its own issues. Whether or not that is, to take current examples from the Washington Post where people are worried about the influence of its owner. So it's not as if somehow commercial news is unproblematic and political funding or state funding is, uniquely problematic. It's certainly the case that we have to be careful, that we have to be smart, and that we have to develop ways so that there can be, an arm's length relationship between the news organizations and the people providing the money. But there's no reason to think that we can't do it. It's not as if Denmark or the United Kingdom are some uniquely enlightened places that are capable of doing this, and there's no possible way in which it could be replicated here.
Just in the few minutes we have left, let's sort of step back to a 30,000-foot view. And since I have you here and you're an academic, I want to ask you about, in this climate of declining trust in journalism and institutions more broadly, given the economic tumult and disruption that this industry is facing, given the fractured audience landscape, the polarization politically in this country, the fact it does seem like the internet news boom has ended and there's more of a bust now, given that there's a few giant media outlets that seem okay while we continue to lose local newspapers. I mean, on and on and on. And you've looked internationally, you've studied the media in France as well. What are you and your colleagues, if we did, to use an academic term, a literature review, and read a bunch of academic papers in this space, what are some takeaways? Is there hope for the future? Does anybody have a grand plan for how to dig out of this hole we've dug, the trust hole, the economic hole?
Is there hope? Yes. Is there a grand plan? No. I can say maybe a couple of things. One, I think, sort of important piece that academics can provide to the debate on trust is that a lot of times it's kind of poorly framed. So trust in the news media has been going down since the 1960s. Now, that doesn't mean that if we go back to the 1960s that the quality of the journalism was actually better. It actually tended to be really subservient to political officials. It tended to be very credulous. And so there's no necessary relationship between declining trust and news quality. It's often also thought that, having more trust will actually lead people to be back. But actually the highest levels of trust in news are at local media. And they're the ones that have the biggest business issue. And so that's, something to think about. That doesn't mean that there aren't issues to sort of consider. I mean, one of the things to ask is what people have in mind when they're actually responding to these polls and saying, I don't trust the news media. They're probably not saying, I don't trust Austin Jenkins to be able to ask fair questions. They're probably thinking, I don't really like what happens in Washington, D.C. I have this general sense that it's kind of distant from my life. I dislike it, and so I say it for that reason. Now, are there sort of bright spots on the horizon? I think that there are a whole series of things that we can point to. One, that there are efforts to actually create, sustainable ventures. Will they all, continue? Will they all succeed? Absolutely not. But one of the things that you can't sort of follow the news business or journalism more generally for too long without kind of being, and this comes back to something I said earlier, inspired by the fact that any sort of rational economic analysis for someone to start a news site, to go into journalism, would be sort of laughed at on its face for the most part, except for a few types of news organizations and a few types of settings. It's not going to be economically lucrative in a lot of instances. They won't actually, succeed in terms of even surviving over a 5-year period. And for journalists, it's a very, very difficult thing. However, you have people who are still doing it, and they're doing it not because they're not aware, but because they really do feel, as you put it earlier, a calling, a sense of passion, a sense of commitment.
Just lastly, are you personally optimistic or pessimistic about the future of journalism, just briefly? I
am optimistic, but I would sort of characterize myself as being somewhat realistically optimistic. I don't think we're ever going to get back to, I think we're truly at a crisis in the sense that we'll never go back to where we once were, but I do think that there are opportunities to build something different and in some ways perhaps better.
Okay, I'm going to stop you there. The report is Statehouse Journalism in Transition. It is available online. Professor Matt Powers from the University of Washington, co-author of this, thank you for coming in. Should also mention you are the co-director of the Center for Journalism, Media, and Democracy, University of Washington, and your most recent book, The Journalist's Predicament, Difficult Choices in a Declining Profession. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Great to see you. Thank you for watching Inside Olympia. We will see you again next week.